right, welcome everybody. Thank you, Dr. Jahnke, for coming back to talk with us this week. We had a wonderful time, and I'm hearing wonderful things about people practicing the Qigong that we did the last time we had you on. So for those of you who weren't here last week or who don't know of him, Roger Jahnke is an amazing Qigong practitioner, teacher of practitioners all over the world, as well as works in organization development and leadership, and also looks at that through the lens of the classics. And so we're going to have a dynamic conversation. I happen to have the privilege of knowing him since I was a small child, and came back to him through a book that he wrote called The Healer Within when I was going through, I was mother of 3 small children and struggling with my own health concerns, and really found some great practices and solace in that work, and was also just so grateful when I found him again via the internet, LinkedIn, and said, would you have a conversation with me? And so gratefully, we've been chatting for the past few weeks, having really amazing conversations about leadership, about self-governance, and the practice of being really an integrity around our own and each other's way of empowering each other in the world to be our fullest selves. So I'll let you tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you're doing here with us today, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Jade. So, yeah, one of the things that we have in common is Chinese medicine. And of course, Chinese medicine is based on theory and ideas and paradigms. And so the Chinese medicine paradigm suggests that there are ways that we can know ourselves more deeply than is common in the Western world. And so given the fact that we both discovered that we're not only practitioners of Chinese medicine, but that we're also practitioners of organizational development, team building, building the, shall we say, cultivating the methodologies for collaboration. It has been a lot of fun for me, and I think you just said it has been fun for you to have the opportunity to reflect on how Chinese medicine, theory, philosophy, etc., worldview, paradigm tend to reflect on organizational development and developing the capacity for teams to be, as effective as possible. So we could call that efficacy of teams. And then, of course, how you have a team that's got a high level of effectiveness. If you don't have players on the team who are, well, at least self-aware. And of course, then isn't it true that often we have high ideals as teams or as corporations, but then when we settle into the trenches of the work that needs to be done, and we find ourselves tangled up in the fact that team member 1 and team member 4 both have what they believe to be the best idea, and are not necessarily listening to each other and supporting a high level of shall we say, thoroughness. And by the way, one of the things that I've discovered regarding efficiency of fulfilling the mission of a corporation or fulfilling the outcomes of a team is that there's a very strong relationship, or actually it's kind of adversarial. It's a little bit like a yin and a yang. One is being thorough and the other is being convenient. And one party might be, even the boss person might be saying, get her done. And then down here at the, I'll call it the council circle of our team, we're not progressing because everybody's under the weight of getting it done to the extent that we're not even able to have heard what the parties to the conversation are trying to say. And so how cool is, well, first of all, how cool is it that we already know how this works? And then how kind of anti-cool is it when people don't understand these ideas? So back to you, Jade, for just a comeback, and then I'll show a few slides, and then we can have a debate or carry on a little bit.
Yeah, it was interesting because you pointed to something that I find one of the primary concerns when I'm working with a team is that hearing each other. How do we even begin to hear each other, and what's required? What's the context that we can cultivate to actually allow that to happen? And what are the skills we need to allow that to happen? And so what is this sort of like in bodies, right? We were doing Qigong, it's like you have to have some level of tension and also some level of release. And I see Edwin is on here, and he was talking about that in an email I got from him this week. And really it's the dance of how do we do a team together? And so I'm wondering what questions other business people might be asking themselves about sort of the thread of how do we connect the classical viewpoint of being human together with our current paradigm of how do we do leadership, how do we do governance, and I know that that's a point that you speak very gracefully to. If you've got a couple of words for us on that, or maybe that'll be part of what else you're going to talk about too.
Well, let me speak to it just very, very directly. For better or worse, we as a species are living with the consequences of domineering top-down management, and that goes to everything. You know, whether we're building cars or trying to support people who are compromised in terms of their resources. The model is, for better or worse, as I said, kind of top down. And so middle management isn't really invited to find the ways that people at the bottom of the process, the people in the trenches, what are their concerns? And what I noticed when I was dealing with Chinese medicine in the clinic, that average people expect the doctor to fix them. And they're not really even oriented to the idea that they could fix themselves. And so medicine basically plays on that. And, historically, when our societies were in a challenge around a worldwide infectious pandemic, the people in charge never said, you can take care of yourself. Never. Nobody ever said it. Nobody. Mm-hmm. And so why? Well, because we are predisposed to top-down control, and that's going to give us a way to be able to sell stuff, because if people don't trust themselves and they trust us instead, then we're going to say, buy this, and they're going to say, well, doctor said I got to buy this. And it's the same with the, with the workers. Workers are used to being told what to do. And so what happens is that they end up sitting around a table, shrugging their shoulders, saying, well, what does it matter what I think? So I'm not going to think. And so top down, they say, do this. So, I'm at risk if I don't do this. And frankly, I don't even know how to think, because I've never been invited to think. And so I believe that, well, and okay, so back to it. What we discovered clinically was that people get better if you give them treatments, but they get even better if you, while you're treating them, you're constantly inviting them to take the opportunity to to learn about themselves and to maximize their well-being. So my work as a consultant in corporations is kind of like perceiving the corporation as, it's even named a corporation, it's a body.
Body, yeah.
And a person is also a corporation. So the general principles for how I would approach a corporation arise from my background in Chinese medicine, which I'm going to show a couple of slides here in just a moment. And I want to lead everybody who ever listens to this through the process that the Chinese culture arrived at for how self-governance is a microcosm of community governance, and how community governance is a microcosm of a larger macrocosm. We'll call it a cosmological macrocosm. And so then we can use the cosmological macrocosm to inform how to work with a nation or a community, and we can use the nation and the community as a macrocosm to the microcosm of our own being, which is then self-governance.
Yeah.
So, shall we launch into those slides?
I have one comment that I realized as you were speaking that came up for me, and you may be speaking to this more, that we're talking about this top-down structure, which I find is pretty common in our corporations. And also that I find clinically is very common for our, for our human experience is, are we leading with, well, or at least we think we're leading with our head and not doing a lot of paying attention to what's going on in our bodies. And I was thinking about that classical aspect of, having to, if we listen to what's going on in our bodies, sometimes it's actually very informative. And so I was just aware of that as you're speaking, that's a common thread in both kinds of bodies, both the organization and the individual. So
well, and when we come back from these slides, one of the things that I would invite you to do is speak just very briefly or generally, or as much as you want, on the whole idea of how, and I'll kind of get at it here in the slides, but not exactly. And so it'd be a good starting place for us when we get back to our dialogue is what if the body is like a kingdom or a corporation, then who's the boss and how does the boss act? And is the boss the heart or is the boss the brain? And of course, we've got a lot of information about how the pathways of information transfer in the body are like twice as many passageways from the heart to the brain as there are from the brain to the heart. Just kind of interesting to know. And then in Chinese medicine and Chinese philosophy, the heart, or what is called the heart mind, is the imperial oversight party, and then each of the organs, the lungs and the liver and the et cetera, are in charge. They're like the ministerial court, or what are sometimes called the officials. And maybe when we get to our consulting jobs, we don't talk too much about the officials from Chinese medicine, but in the back of our mind, that's the only thing that's really driving the conversation. And we're looking for, like, well, who has imperial, who's like the liver, who's doing the planning, who's in the storeroom, like stocking things up, and how's that all working? And how do these people all relate to the imperial oversight part of the character and so forth? So when we get back, maybe you could just, because I've got a slide in here that's not very easy to see, and we'll discuss it a little bit, and then I'll discuss it a little bit, and then we can discuss it more.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, so you're seeing one slide?
I'm not seeing it yet. Are you guys seeing it?
Maybe I forgot to share my screen. Let's see, let's go back to here. Let's do screen share. And let's go there.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, our topic for today is how is it that ancient wisdom and the concept of self-governance, which is the microcosm of world governance or corporate governance, how does that all work? And I put in these images of Chinese people, had conversations and listening to each other. And then down below, we've got the Native American who basically we borrowed the Constitution from the Iroquois Nation. And we get a feeling like this person in the middle, this Aboriginal person, this indigenous person, this shamanic era type person is, extemporating on his point of view. And even the soldiers, probably who are wearing red coats, are listening. And of course, the implication is we don't always just listen to the redcoats. And so then let's go on to the idea of governance. Governance refers to a process whereby elements in society, and that is ourself included, wield power. And how do we wield power over ourselves as well as over others, and influence and enact policies and decisions concerning public life and social upliftment, product development, and so forth. Many of the elements of and principles of underlying good government have become an integral part of the meaning of teamwork and collaboration and so forth. Why would we even want to have a discussion like this, right? Well, the answer is that people who want to get something done do not want to have this discussion. They just want to get it done. But what we're talking about is collaboration. And to be able to get a high level of enthusiasm to develop a really high functioning team, theoretically, it's better to invite people to understand each other and so forth. And in the ancient societies, this is an invitation to discovering one's own essential nature. And the Chinese concept of a person who operates from a high level of purpose, which is directly associated with one's essence, is called a zhenren. Zhenren means, zhen means, here it is, zhen means true or real. And wow, isn't that an interesting concept? Because we could say that I'm a real person when I'm ordering people around. We could say that I'm a real person when I'm hogging the limelight. We could say that I'm a real person when I'm inventing a world that I think is real, but actually is only real relative to my self-perception. The Chinese view of zhen means essentially true. And we won't linger here, but this is a conversation for another time and probably out of the range of what we would want to generally talk about at all, because it's very, very philosophical. And that is that what is true? Well, what is true if you live in a four-dimensional world could be very different than what is true if you live in the ultimate world. And what is the ultimate world? Well, if you ask a Buddhist or a Taoist or a shaman or any of those kinds of characters, the ultimate world is not the one. So what do you do about that? And the answer, of course, well, my answer would be that what you do about that is you invite people to live as if they're allowed to understand themselves deeply. And when we give people the invitation to investigate themselves deeply, it's almost always going to be true that they will discover that there's aspects of themselves that they have been neglecting because of the natural flow of the culture. So we call that acculturation, or we call that culture centricity, meaning that I center my ideals not on myself, but on the culture. So I happen to be very fascinated with, and this is part of the discussion that you and I have been having, Jade, with the methodologies for self-governance and community governance or corporate governance or family governance that have arisen from the very, very, well, not very, very ancient, but quite ancient tribes in China around 500 BC. Now, one of the things that happened in most cultures is that around 500 BC, a little earlier or a little later, many cultures began writing. And if you think of shamans, they don't write stuff down. Like the Native Americans are a very, very profound example of the fact that most ancient societies who reached incredible conclusions about how to sustain themselves for thousands and thousands and thousands of years without developing what we call commerce. So we think of these people as being inarticulate and super archaic and having like no insight whatsoever. But in fact, what was written down about 2,500 years ago was what the humans had been developing and thinking about and developing for 100,000 years or 500,000 years. And I just want to linger here for a moment because you would think, well, that's impossible. The humans couldn't have been very smart. They all just lived in, straw houses and they didn't wear any clothes. And, so what's the value of living in a straw house? Well, if it falls down, you just build it the next day. Anyway, we don't want to get too lost in political implications of the short-sighted thinking, our culture sensitivity, which has led us to where we now live in houses that you cannot build in a day. So let's don't go there. Let's just go to the fact that these foundational ideas emerged from ancient cultures that did not write things down until about 500 BC. At the time that the Chinese culture was writing things down in this era, there are 4 or 5, there are many, but the 5 chosen texts. And I don't know, can you see this bar down here that's covering the bottom line of the text or no?
I think I can see the whole text.
Okay, great. That's good to know. So these concepts were written down in what are these texts, which are called, and I recommend these buddy who's interested in governance because they will pretty much just blow your mind and leave you thinking, why didn't I know more about myself? Why didn't I know more about the brilliance of ancient societies? Why didn't I know more? Why didn't I have more respect for the fact that the humans at around 500 BC had been being humans for genetically 3 million years? And why didn't I know more about how the intelligence of the humans at around 2 million years still had not discovered fire. And how did they manage all of that? And then when they did discover fire, does that just mean that they were stupid and had no intelligence whatsoever until they finally came up with fire? And then, of course, many people would say, well, the humans didn't know anything until they came up with commerce. And frankly, I would argue that commerce was the original point of disintegration of what I would call authentic living. And, I'll admit, I'm a sentimentalist about these things. I grow vegetables. I have fruit trees. I catch rainwater. I mean, I kind of act like a person who lived during that time. So I just admit that. So then the first book is called the I Ching. You may have heard of it. I would invite you to go back to it, not so much as a fortune-telling tool, but as a tool for understanding what is Zhenren. What does it mean, a true person? And how do I self-reflect to be able to develop my idea for what to do next? Not what is somebody else telling me that I should do next, but what do I know, because I know myself, about what to do next. The second book is the Tao Te Ching, which is widely known by most people, and so we won't linger there, but it is a beautiful book on self-governance, and it also mentions governing others. Then, from about the same era of the Tao Te Ching, is a huge compendium, which is called the Guanzi. And 3 of the chapters of the Guanzi are about governance of the world relative to governance of the self. So in other words, we can go cosmos, world, kingdom or nation, family, and self. But we can also go up by saying the self follows the principles of the family follows the principles of the community follows the principles of the nation follows the principles of the world, and the world follows the principles of nature, or cosmological source, or what we want to call that. So in a big compendium, the Guanzi, there would be a chapter on mathematics, there would be a chapter on agriculture, there would be a chapter on medicine and science, there'd be a chapter on the cosmos and star watching, call that astronomy. You're probably familiar with the fact that Chinese culture has very highly developed astrology, so astronomy would probably be a part of one chapter. And so the Guanzi has many, many chapters. 3 of those chapters are on governance. And I'll give you the name of a book that's an English translation that refers to these 3 chapters, and it's called The Thread of Tao. Thread of Tao. And the last name of the person who wrote it is Reid, R-E-I-D. One more of these books, Hainan Zi, is a book about governance that was written about 500 years after the Guanzi. And it has the same mood, which is I want to see if I can capture this, because it's just a beautiful idea that's inherent to all these books, is how can I feel secure? How can I feel secure in knowing that I'm not only in accord with the family, I'm also in accord with my own destiny? Or I could say that I'm operating in accord with the corporation, but that I'm allowed to operate in accord with the corporation in accord with my own destiny. which is a pretty big deal. Because if you're working on the line in a company and they replace you with a robot, and you think, well, I was acting from the highest level of my own destiny. What happened? And of course, it's hard to trace these things and so forth. And mainly, the only thing I can think about now is that I left the letter R out of the word incredible. So just mentally put that word back in there. Put that word back in. But just a few more slides back to our discussion is. What does it mean, Tao? And the Tao is a character in the Chinese language that has a multiplicity of opinions. It's kind of like the word love. It's also kind of like the word truth. There are many definitions for the truth, because I'll tell you what I think is the truth, and then the Pope will tell you what he thinks is the truth, and the president will tell you he thinks is the truth. And frankly, I don't think listening to me or any other of these men has any relevance. Would I listen to the truth if it came from a goddess or a woman who really was thought? Actually, I think personally tend to defer to a goddess or a shamaness or somebody who's had children. Just it's a personal view, and makes me a feminist, I'm not sure. But the main thing that I want to say here is that the way doesn't just mean a pathway, and it doesn't mean my way or the highway. What it means is the way. And how do you figure out what the way is? And as a personal view, I think that the way is inherent to the nature of the universe. And therefore, the way things are, it's not a path to what I want. It's the path that I'm on. So then you get to ask the question, who invented the path? Am I self-determining? Or did I before I took on a body and a consciousness? Or was I self-determined by another force? I don't know the answer to that. But when we think of the fact that the world is shaped in a way that has a way that we can be in it, it really asks the question, am I participating in something bigger than my perception? And I like the idea that the answer to that is yes. And then I love the concept of inherency, which means I am inherently potentiated to be myself. And then I get to ask the question, did I know that? And then I get to ask the question, am I acting like that? Very, very powerful how this leads us constantly. The Chinese paradigm is constantly pushing us into a relationship with an aspect of ourself which may or may not have become obvious or even there in a culture-centric sort of way. So then I'm going off Tao Te Ching. This DE factor is virtue, and we get to ask the question, what does virtue mean? Because in our culture, we think virtue means being good relative to what somebody said we should do. And that'd be like God or the Pope or the church or my boss or my coach, or, if I'm a virtuous person, if I fulfill on being in accord with somebody else's view of what I should be. And however, the Chinese character for virtue doesn't mean that. It means inherent character. It means inner power. It's integral to our own three treasures, body, mind, and spirit. wow, that's a much bigger deal. And think of it this way. Have you ever heard that phrase, by virtue of? When you hear the phrase virtue of, you you're not, oh, I'm so sorry. You're not hearing a phrase that says, did you do it right relative to a set of rules? When you hear the words by virtue of, it usually means because of. And like, what is cause? Wow, I mean, that's a really, really, I mean, we could say that held a gun and shot that person, or that guy planted a tree, and we say that is there because that person, but then why did that person decide to plant a tree? It's just a beautiful moment for us to be able to reflect on the fact that virtue means that the cause is who I am essentially. And then to be able to actually be virtuous doesn't mean that I do what somebody else said I should do. It's me being true to myself. So now, to wrap this up, as a doctor and a consultant and as a coach, what I realize is when it comes down to corporations and missions and teams, how can you shall we say, transition all of this wisdom onto a corporate mission and teamwork? And it goes like this. People may or not be operating in accord with their essential nature, as this is typically neglect. Talked about that. Collaboration requires communication. Communication requires listening. Listening is difficult until one is settled and assured within oneself. Assuredness depends on one's life. So getting people to be engaged at work doesn't mean that somebody told them what to do. In my world, and in the world that I would want to support any corporation in creating, it means inviting people to understand themselves deeply and to collaborate with purpose and intent, not just around the company mission, but also around one's personal mission. So collaboration really requires excellent communication founded in a settled life. Well, how do you get a settled life? And that takes us back to Chinese philosophy and medical theory, which suggests that a person is actually a reflection of the entire cosmos. So we know how solar systems work, kind of, and we know how galaxies work, kind of, and we know how super galaxies work, kind of, and we know a little about what a black hole is, and we know a little bit about what a wormhole is, and so forth. So the Chinese, for whatever reason, figured out that to have an integral human being, you get to ask the question, or an integral operation, you get to ask the question, what is the inherency for how a person expresses their virtues, not being right or wrong relative to a religion and not told what they should do, but how do they actually bring everything about themselves to this? And as you see over here on the left, vision, mission, strategy, execution, and tendency, whatever that might mean, it's just a kind of an interesting juxtaposition of yin yang and 5 elements and corporate workflow and so forth. So this is how we've done it here at my organization, which is called Health Action. And we developed a coaching method, which is based on all the concepts that we just talked about, has the central focus be self-care relative to all these parts of a person's. We use this model in clinical practice to support people in developing a sense of themselves and getting the courage to be able to believe in themselves, and then to establish intentions and goals relative to their nutrition, exercise, stress mastery, and so forth. And then in corporations, the same thing happens. So in the clinic, the treatment is, can I use these acupuncture needles and these herbal formulas to support this person in expressing their best well-being? And in a corporation, what can I do? How can I feel the pulse of the corporation? And how can I insert the acupuncture needles into the key acupoints of the corporation to develop the radiant and efficient well-being that supports the corporation? But the corporation, what we feel is that it's not corporation down to people what they should do. It's people up, supporting the corporation and developing a way to actually be holistic. So it becomes an invitation to a holistic life planning process, a care process, a work-life balance process. These are the foundations for collaboration and communication. So, like that. Do I have any more slides here? No. So that's the rant. So then let's go on to, I'm going to try to stop my share. I can find my cursor here. And then it's to you, Jade.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm aware that in a certain way I rarely talk about the philosophy while I'm working with people. I work predominantly in a very hands-on, practical way, because I find that sometimes people get caught trying to figure out the theory. So I sort of work from the body up, where we do the thing and then let the theories arrive later. And so this is really a wonderful moment in which you've actually described the work that I do, actually, that we do, and the background of it, and connected it. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm also aware, for those of you watching, he has managed to say a lot in a very short amount of time. And it may be worth going back and really listening again and sort of unpacking some of the layers that I'm aware were in your speaking as you were going through those slides. And so the slides help to consolidate and simplify, and your speaking also is very both rich and simple, and I appreciate the way of delivery that you do. So shall we have a little conversation and see if do you have questions about how you do this? I was looking at your circle with the self-care in the middle, and it's a beautiful sort of structure. The structure of how we work is a little bit different, and the principles are all exactly really the same in terms of we start from the inside, and we trust that we will affect all of the different parts of the world around us as we begin to live into those more fully, more effectively, more efficiently. And so if you guys want to sort of switch back to have a gallery view, so we can, if you want to chat, you can. If you've got questions. Roger, are there things you wanted to kind of go back and forth with me about before we invite other people into the conversation?
No, I'm ready to jump in with everyone. However, I just want to be sure that before we do, that you would pick up on that note that I said earlier, and just give a couple of examples from your background with the organs as officials. And, could you just speak a little bit to the, maybe not go the whole rant on the 5 elements all the way around, but kind of like your favorite ones that's like they're the most accurate to you?
So I'm not sure about the most accurate. What is there specific about accuracy? I was thinking when you're talking, I do look at, and again, I don't really talk this way much with my corporate clients. I'm looking for, are the functions of the various officials showing up, and where do things look stuck? I'm doing what you said, of feeling the pulse, in essence, by talking to people mostly, and often, in the world in which I was actually going on site to places, I would also look and I would watch the activity and how the interactions were, what the space was like, what the sort of layers of that were.
Well, I'll just
And
say
yeah,
myself,
good.
like I, I get, like, I've always really understood very clearly that the heart is like the ruler.
Yeah.
But then when we get down to, you know, the other elements, the wood element and the earth and so forth, I've always kind of gotten lost there. And part of why you've stated, and in my own work, I would never show these slides to my clients. They'd just say, well, Acco or you, they want to know, like, how do we get her done?
Yeah.
And so my idea would be that how we get her done is that we invite ourselves as a corporate head decision maker to allow the forces below me to be, probably in almost every case, more a part of the vitality of how we accomplish things than just me saying, in 2 months, show me that you've got this done.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, then if you've got one thing that you want to get done and the person says you get her done, and then everybody clatters around down, people quit, people put their hands up, people say, I'm never going to be able to really get my point of view across, so I'll just shut up and do the work. So there's some kind of foundational thing that doesn't have anything to do with a goal. It has everything to do with a culture. Now, how do we transform that culture so that when we put a goal into the machine, everybody rallies up? And I don't know. I mean, I've said
Yeah.
it, and you've probably said it a couple of ways, but say it one more way.
Well, I was going to say that one of the things that I hear when you're speaking, and I know for those of you watching who the concept of the heart as ruler in Chinese medicine and in this sort of philosophical conversation we're having is it's not about this sort of muscle in the chest that beats. It is though about the presence. I think of it sometimes like the sunshine, right? The presence of which um, is sort of, it's like if you think about the king who sits on the throne, rules by way of being virtuous and really doesn't go and try to figure things out and pull on things and, like, pull the carrot tops to make them grow or pull on the employees to get them to do their work. What they're doing is they're setting the tone of trust, essentially, in health and in a well organization. They're sitting there and they're sort of trusting that everybody actually is fully capable and living into the various roles of the kingdom in other ways. From my perspective, I don't know that the person who may be titled the leader in an organization may or may not be in that role. Oftentimes I see the leader is actually playing the role of what you might call the liver or the wood element, where they're actually more sort of doing the vision, the large vision, and they're holding the space of that large vision. And somebody else may be holding the space of sort of the background conversation that goes on. Sort of the founding impulse is often where this conversation lives, and the culture is sort of designed by what looks like an invisible force, but really it's about how smooth are the interactions between all of the various parts. And when this is out of sort of out of its own virtue is a way of speaking, oftentimes this shows up as this role, whether it be the formal leader or an informal leader, as being a little bit frenetic and grasping at things and trying to figure it out. The image that sometimes comes is like a bird in a cage that's been rattled, where it's like flapping to try to find its way back to stability. And in the presence of the role of the heart in this paradigm being frenetic, everything else is also in frenetic kind of chaos, and it makes it very, very difficult for all of the other roles to work smoothly, because they are constantly checking for what's the outcome going to be for that if we keep doing this way. Is that sort of talking to what you're speaking about here a bit?
Yeah, indeed. And I like the idea that that the heart isn't necessarily the boss.
Right.
And that strategic voice that the might be leaves the imperial role to actually could be kind of like a culture thing that arises. And that's even kind of like, I like that. I mean, that's not that I've never seen it, but seeing it again and realizing that it's not roles or people, it's about roles, it's about phenomena under the auspices of certain department of our process, or a portion of our process, but it doesn't have to be occupied by a particular person. It's even better if it's not,
right,
to some extent, so that
right.
the ownership is more widely shared.
I was going to say that's what I'm always looking more for, the function, right? And I often find that when everybody else is doing their role, and if I can help others sort of roles show up smoothly, the role of that heart sort of gets to be it's sort of that ministerial fire. It's sort of warm, and you don't know why it's warm. You walk into a company, a building, say, in the old days when we walked into buildings, but you'd walk into a building and you'd feel something, and you didn't know what it was, and it appears to be a feeling, right? But what I'm always looking for is what are the other roles doing that are supporting that feeling to be able to feel like that. And in the sort of Western paradigm, I'm often looking at that as, how are people's mirroring each other, and who is designing what they're doing that's being mirrored, and who is sort of just in the mirror place. And what I'm looking to do is empower each person to become the little fire that other people get to kind of come to and be warmed into mirror, so that they're each have an empowerment to shift the relationship to that. If it's feeling frenetic, if one person's feeling frenetic, that each person has that, all of those also functions as whole as possible in each place, so that there's always sort of a chance for some balancing between individuals in a larger corporation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes great sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, what about the peanut gallery? What do you have to say?
You guys can unmute yourselves and we can just have a little chat here.
Thank you for that talk. That was really wonderful. And I especially love the last little bit about kind of looking to the phenomena maybe between individuals. I think our eyes click onto kind of like these people doing certain things, and we confuse the happening with the role, and to start looking between the people in clusters of people to understand what's actually happening. I have been thinking a lot about how we are all made of many more bacterial cells than even human cells. And so it's like we're just Russian dolls of happenings. It's fascinating to kind of develop that kind of perception, to be able to see that outside of ourselves as well. You mentioned very early on that, there's this predisposition to top-down control. Why is it? And is it like a biological baggage that we are predisposed to seek the very things that we don't actually want?
Wow, I love that question, and I think about it all the time. I frankly just throw my hands up in wonder. I mean, all you have to do is turn on the television and watch for less than a minute, and you realize that this is really talk about inherency. Um,
Uh-huh.
so I'm going to tell you where I ended up on this, and I don't expect that anybody should have this idea. It's just personal, my idea. And it goes like this. It is a hopeful deal. Believe that the world that we inhabit is supposed to be the way it was. But it's clearly not a realistic idea because the world that we inhabit is not the way it was. And it's almost guaranteed that it's never going to be the way it was. And so, how do I manage my feelings of this? How I do it is, and my wife's name is Rebecca, and we have a very good relationship, and we talk about things all the time. And at one point, at most points, if she's a little down, I'm fine, or if I'm a little down, she's fine. There was this one time when we were both down at the same time, and we really kind of got into. We didn't have the leverage of the party to kind of stop, and so we just got into the dialogue of like, well, what is this weight that we keep finding ourselves experiencing? And we basically very mission-driven people. And so the mission is create a better world. Like I'm a Boy Scout, and we always learned when you go camping that you leave the campsite in better condition than you found. And I've always felt like that was a really reasonable ideal, and I'm attached to that thought. And therefore, as an adult, I've been very interested in leaving the world better than I found it. And so that depression was really rising from the disappointment again and again and again and again. So I started picking up on this whole idea in around 1963 or 65, somewhere around there. So that's a hefty amount of time ago. And every time I would realize that I wasn't really succeeding at leaving the world in better than I found it, I would have to be confronted with the question, how do I feel about that? And the answer was, I didn't feel good about that at all. So then, and then Rebecca was having the same feeling. So then we came up with this question. If you knew that the thing that you were working so hard on was really not going to work out, would you still work on it? So if you knew that your desire to change the world or fix the world or leave the world a better place than you found it became clear to you was not going to work out, would you still do the work? And the answer was yes. And so what we've done is we eliminated the weight, feeling like we weren't seeing at making the world a better place. So then there's one little thing that you can extrapolate from this, and that is the world supposed to get better? And so I'll tell just a beautiful little story about that. It'll be like 3 or 4 lines, and it goes like this. If you were God and you were creating a multitude of kinds of worlds, all the way from worlds that are horrible, in our personal anthropological or anthropomorphic point of view, that horrible worlds, and then as God, you're creating a bunch of fantastic worlds, and then you had more than a dozen or maybe even 1,000,000 different ways that you felt these worlds were supposed to go, which God probably doesn't do, but we're thinking as if we might be God to try to make ourselves feel better, I would say that God made worlds that were horrible so that they could get better. And not all, just some. And that God made worlds that were marvelous so that they could get worse. Why? Well, because entities that live on those worlds, and again, I'm just thinking about humans, and you already mentioned the biome, which I have no idea what that character is up to. But imagine that at some point, if it's true that there's multiple universes and that in a way everything is happening at once, everything you can imagine or not imagine is happening at the same time because God is everything anyway, then there's probably somebody a little bit like me, and maybe it's even me, that lives on a world that's getting better. And there's someone like me, and it might even be me, who's living on a world that's getting worse. And that's just the inherency of it. And so the fact that I'm having the experience of being in the 4 dimensions in a world that looks like it's getting worse doesn't really matter, because there's also many worlds that are getting better. And there are probably some worlds where people never even show up in buildings and drive cars and dig for oil and so forth, that just get to be pristine forever, which is kind of cool. So I feel like personally I've solved that problem, which is, I think it's inherent to the world that we live in that the patriarchy collapsed, and that the patriarchy has taken over, and it doesn't really look like the matriarchy is going to get it back. And so I think the patriarchy is going to just drive it into the trash heap, and probably it's supposed to go. That's the inherency of it. My view, not intending that anybody else should believe it.
I love that.
What about Anne Marie? What is she thinking?
But then, given all of that, what is the role that each of us has to play in the world on an individual basis? I don't do corporate stuff. I'm an acupuncturist in practice for myself, so I see individual patients.
Yeah.
And many of them are very complicated. So each time I see them, what can I do today to help this patient at this time with whatever problem is presenting? And I think in those small ways, even if the whole world is going to pot, we are making the world better. And so that's how I approach my practice is, who am I seeing today? And I've been seeing my patients for a while, and today she's different than last week. Different symptoms are bothering. So I just focus on, okay, I am here, I am present. I think of myself as the needle. In addition to bringing needles, what can I do today, right now, to make it better for this patient and his or her family? So it doesn't, the world's going to pot, but I think we all have individual effects that maybe over time will reverse some of that, and maybe not. But I can't take a negative viewpoint because that's not who I am.
Yeah, or that's not how you're able to maximize your own sustained functionality so that you can be the role that you're in with these people who are longing to have, to have a different experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, love it. And, one of these days, maybe we get into a roundtable on the subject of something that you just brought to mind, which is, when I was studying Chinese medicine in Hawaii, the interns and would, put our heads together sometimes. And one of the questions that we asked is the acupuncture really doing anything? And is it that the presence of our teacher was a, super just story to be told, kind of Taoist, originally from China, long lineage, big long story, gorgeous philosophical framework, carried carefully for 60 or 70 generations or something like that. And when you walk into the clinic, the smell of those herbs was just palpable. And then you'd meet with Dr. Chang, and she was, just such a formidable presence. And everything that she did was, it was infused with, this is exactly what's need to happen next. And there's no doubt that when you leave this clinic, you're going to feel like something just amazing happened to you, or is happening to you, or will be happening to you in the next couple of days. Just no question.
Mm.
And then, you'd lay on a table and it was fragrant, and you had some tea and the music was playing, and you'd be kind of nailed down with these acupuncture needles. And then, how would it be possible to not have a powerful experience in a context like that?
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, you are the needle, and then those little silver devices that you plug in here and there, they probably have some significant effect, because there's a nervous system there, there's a chi system there, there's a longing, there's an inherency, there's a tangled inherency has a longing, untangled, and become more free to function in the way that it was originally designed to function. And so all of these qualities are you, and the needles and the environment and everything else about it are just inviting the chi or the function to bump up in some way or another.
Mm-hmm.
I like that view.
Fun.
This is great. Thank you. It's a really amazing conversation. I am feeling so grateful and privileged to know you, and to listen to you, and to hear what it really, essentially, the essence, the inherency of you that called me back to you after so many years. That I said, where are you? Where is that essence in the world? And I sought you out, and I'm so grateful for your willingness to play and engage in the conversation, and to know that we're doing parallel work that has this similar path, trajectory, practice.
Well, I'm really glad too that we were able to have like a little round table with some good friends who are, at least mildly predisposed to these ideas, and that we could kind of like just, sort of ramp it up a little bit for whoever else happens to get to tune in at some point.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming. Thanks everybody for showing up. If you're watching the replay, you can follow. I will put contact information so that if you would like to follow Dr. Jahnke's work and to see more of what he does in the world, there will be a link in the click below on the YouTube channel here. So, and look forward to seeing you guys. So thanks.
Thank you. Wish you well. Wish you well.